That's a part of spiritual growth that people do not always talk about or not nearly enough. And it's the part where your life begins to feel unfamiliar before it begins to make sense, right? So you start noticing that certain conversations do not sit right with you anymore. Things that you once enjoyed no longer bring the same peace. You may find yourself pulling back from environments, habits, or even relationships that once felt normal. And it can be confusing because no one may have done anything terrible. You're just different. But when you don't understand what God is doing, it is easy to misread that change. So you may think that you are becoming, too serious, too distant, or difficult. You may wonder whether you are, being judgmental or whether you're somehow losing yourself. But what if you are not losing yourself? What if you are becoming more like the woman that God created you to be? Ephesians chapter 4 tells us to put off concerning the former conversation, the old man, and to put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. And that means there is an old way of living, thinking, responding, and relating that cannot go with us forever. And the difficult part is that the old version of you was familiar. She knew how to survive. She knew what made her feel included. She knew what to do and what to say in the specific rooms. She knew what to accept because she was tired of waiting for better. So when God begins to change you, the transition can feel, less like a celebration and more like a loss. So you may no longer feel comfortable in places where you once blended in easily. You may stop finding joy in the things that used to distract you. You become more selective about who has access to your heart, your time, your peace. And then suddenly you're standing in a space between who you used to be and who you are becoming. And that space can feel lonely. But, loneliness is not always proof that you made the wrong decision. That's what the enemy would try to tell you. Like, yeah, now you have no friends, you're alone, you're bored, right? So, but sometimes it is the space where God teaches you how to stand with Him before He brings the right people, the right opportunities, and assignments into your life. I went through a rebellious season in my, late teens and early 20s, and I was around people who smoked weed and drank, and I participated in some of that myself. And at the time, it felt familiar. It was the kind of environment I knew. So I didn't think much about it. I was used to being around it. But as I grew closer to God, spending more time in worship and prayer and just communion with Him, something in me began to change. And I remember, going to this music studio in Los Angeles with a friend. This was a friend, and her friend invited her. And there was a lot of men there, and only just a few women. And people were smoking, drinking. There was rap music playing. And I was feeling so uncomfortable. And, what stood out to me was that none of it was new to me. I had been around those kinds of environments before, but I was not the same woman anymore. My spirit was troubled because God had changed what I could be comfortable with. So I was not better than anyone in the room. I simply knew that that place no longer fit who God was forming me to be. And one thing I want to be careful to say here is that, outgrowing something doesn't automatically mean you are to make a sudden dramatic decision. So I want to say that because, I'm not sure what the thing you are outgrowing, but it doesn't have to happen overnight or be, something dramatic that you move away from. So every uncomfortable feeling is not a command from God to quit your job, for example, or end a friendship. So that's what I'm saying, or to move away or cut someone off. Yeah, you don't have to move to Atlanta because things aren't going right where you are. God may have another assignment there for you. But ultimately, like, we need wisdom, we need prayer, and we need to pay attention to whether God is producing greater peace, clarity, humility, and obedience in us, or whether we are simply reacting from hurt, fear, or pride, right? That's the thing. Like, yeah, this city is not doing it for me. Ain't no good men here, or these jobs are something else. I'm moving to Houston, right? But when the same discomfort it continues to surface and you begin to recognize that something is pulling you away from the woman that God is forming, then it is worth taking seriously. That it is then. But because growth often begins with a changed appetite, there are women who once believed they wanted a relationship at any cost. Okay, they were tired of being alone. They wanted the title, the companionship, the feeling of finally being chosen. But after walking with God for a while, their prayer begins to change. They still desire a marriage, but they don't want just any attention anymore. They want peace. They want a man with integrity. They want someone whose life points them toward Christ instead of constantly pulling them into confusion. The desire for marriage did not disappear. Their understanding of what they could accept changed. And that same thing can happen in your career. You may have once been, willing to take any role that looked impressive. 6 figures, yep, I'm taking it, right? An opportunity that offered more money or any path that seemed to prove you were successful. But God may begin showing you that a bigger title is not worth losing your peace, your health, your integrity, or your ability to show up for the people you love. Sometimes those jobs can pull you away from family, right? And that should be our priority. So, that's not a lack of ambition, though. That's wisdom when you can recognize what God is doing. You can still want more for your life while allowing God to redefine what more means. And that is why outgrowing an old version of yourself can be difficult. The old version may have built, around things that you once thought you needed. So approval, attention, control, being seen as successful, having a certain kind of life by a certain age. When your identity begins to move deeper into Christ, those things do not have the same power over you. You begin to realize that you do not have to force your way into rooms that God has not called you to. Several years ago, I went to NBA All-Star Weekend in New York City with a group of girlfriends, and we were at an event, and a man who had been hanging around our group said to me, "You look too serious. You don't look like you know how to have a good time." And at the time, I was offended. I was younger and I wanted men to find me attractive. I didn't want to seem like a prude or like I did not fit in. So I took his comment personally. But later, I saw it differently. What I thought was, an insult was actually confirmation that I did not belong in every environment or need every person's approval. Even then, God was beginning to change me. I was becoming less comfortable around certain things, less interested in attention for attention's sake, and more aware that I did not have to become, someone else just to be accepted. You do not have to stay attached to an old version of your life simply because it's familiar. There's a moment in Genesis chapter 12 when God tells Abram, "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee." God called Abram away from what he knew before showing him where he was going. And that is significant. God did not hand Abram the full map. He called him to trust. And I think that's where many of us struggle. We may sense that God is changing us, but we want him to explain exactly what comes next before we release, what is behind us. That comfortable life. Comfortable, but we might be frustrated, but it's comfortable, right? So we want to know like who will replace the friendships that no longer fit. We want to know what will happen if we stop chasing the opportunity that looks good but does not feel right. We want to know whether the life that we desire is still possible if we no longer do the things that we used to or in the way we used to. But faith is not always having a detailed explanation. Rarely is. Sometimes faith is recognizing that God is leading you out of something before you can fully see what he's leading you into. And there is a belief gap here that, it can keep women stuck for years. Some women believe that, if they let go of what's familiar, that they will have nothing, nothing to replace, nothing to hold on to, nothing to show for the change. So they keep returning to relationships, habits, thought patterns, and environments that God has already been trying to grow them beyond. And if that is where you are, I want to invite you to my free recorded webinar. It's called Waiting Well, 3 Belief Shifts that Move You Out of Delay and into Divine Delivery. And so inside that webinar, share 3 belief shifts that can help you, see your waiting season differently and begin recognizing what may be keeping you tied to a version of life that God is asking you to release. So the link will be down below. So now this doesn't mean that spiritual growth requires you to become isolated or, suspicious of everyone around you. God did not create us to live disconnected from people, but it does mean that you should be honest about, what is shaping you. So pay attention to what happens in you after certain conversations. So pay attention to what you begin believing about yourself when you spend time in certain environments. Pay attention to whether people closest to you make it easier to obey God, or whether they're constantly inviting you back to those patterns that you've been trying to leave. And that kind of awareness is it's not judgment, it's stewardship. So you are responsible for guarding what God is building in you. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23 says, "Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." So guarding your heart is not about becoming closed off. It is about becoming wise enough to recognize what has access to your inner life, and that may require you to grieve some things. So you may grieve the version of yourself who felt more carefree. You may grieve friendships that change. You may grieve a dream that no longer feels like the dream God is asking you to pursue. You may even grieve, the timeline you thought your life would follow. And grief, it does not mean you're moving backward. It can be part of making room for what is true now. And for me, I have been, to a few different NBA All-Star weekend trips, and it allowed me to check out a new city, experience the energy and the vibe, meet and see celebrities. But it started feeling uncomfortable because it was a party event, right? It was flirting. It came with pressure to look my best and attract attention, and it no longer aligned with who I was becoming. So I decided to stop going, even though it was a good time with people that I care about. And I can articulate it now, but when I decided to stop going, all I knew was that I began feeling uncomfortable. So, the old version of you may have needed to know every detail before she obeyed. The woman God is forming is learning to trust him with the details that she cannot control. The old version of you may have believed that being chosen by people was the same as being secure. But the woman that God is forming is learning that her security comes from Christ. The old version of you may have measured progress by, what was visible. But the woman God is forming is beginning to understand that some of God's deepest work happens when no one else can applaud it. Right? So you're relying on God and not outside influences. So if your life feels different now, do not rush to label that difference as failure, but bring it before God. Ask him for wisdom. Stay close to the word. Let him show you what needs to be released, what needs to be healed, and what needs to be protected. You do not have to become someone else to walk with God. You are becoming more fully who he created you to be. And while that process can feel unfamiliar, Christ is not unfamiliar with you. He knows who you have been. He knows what you have carried. He knows what you have prayed for. And he knows exactly who he is forming you to become. So God bless you, royal ones. I will see you in the next one.